to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about scientific research on healing and the laying on of hands. Our guest is Dr. Beverley Rubic, biophysicist at San Francisco State University in the Center for Interdisciplinary Science. Dr. Rubic has conducted experiments on the effects of healers on bacteria in a controlled laboratory environment. Dr. Rubic, is there really such a thing as spiritual healing?
Well, I believe so, based on some of the studies that I've done on so-called spiritual healers, such as Olga Worrell, who works very closely with a church in Baltimore. And I've heard of innumerable cases of spontaneous healings following her applied laying on of hands or her intention via prayers. And over the last 4 years, we've brought her into our laboratory and tested her abilities. That is, she placed her hands near bacterial cultures in our laboratory, and we measured significant effects over controls that she did not treat.
One of the difficulties that many people have with the whole concept of spiritual healing and the laying on of hands is a certain television program that was very popular some years ago, in which people would come up from the audience with all sorts of maladies. There would be a laying on of hands, and they would throw down their crutches and waltz away, and there was a great deal of skepticism that was associated in the public's mind with that. And many people associate the concept of spiritual healing with some kind of showbiz.
Yes, I understand that, and it's also in the realm of miracles and religion, which doesn't mix very well with science. You know, over a long period of time, science and religions have been at odds with one another, and there is that problem. All I can say is that when we bring these people into the laboratory and test them under very controlled conditions where there can be no hocus pocus and no possibility of a placebo effect, an effect between two people simply because the sick person believes that something is being done, we're using cultures of cells. I don't believe that we have the same interaction of consciousness with cells. I don't believe that they have any knowledge that we're doing anything to them in the laboratory. And yet we measure effects, which are significant, effects that are significantly above the control values. I'm talking about effects ranging from a few percent upwards of about 50% in magnitude.
Let's talk about some of the specifics of the scientific experiment. You talk about cells in a culture or in a test tube environment, in a laying on of hands. What kind of cells are they, and what is different about them after the laying on of hands than before the laying on of hands, or if the laying on of hands had not taken place?
I'm using a culture of bacteria known as Salmonella typhimurium. This is a bacteria that I did my dissertation work on, actually, at UC Berkeley. I worked about 6 years on the strain, and I know it very well in terms of its mobility under the microscope and its growth behavior. It happens to cause food poisoning in humans, and you might say, well, why would we want to investigate the laying on of hands on such a strange creature as a bacterium? First of all, because it's perhaps the best known organism. It's really the biomedical model. What we know about the biochemistry and physiology of bacteria provides us with much information about our own cells and higher animal cells. It's really the simplest possible cell, and so it's a very good model in which to study healing. The experiments involved liquid cultures of bacteria in a medium, which we presented to Olga, and some of them contained antibiotics. These are substances that inhibit the growth of bacteria, things that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, such as typical drugs, tetracycline, penicillin. These are drugs which inhibit bacterial growth. And we tested the ability of healers to affect the growth of the bacteria in the presence of these drugs and also in their absence. What we found was that the bacteria without the antibiotics didn't seem to have any significant effect after treated by healers over the control groups. In other words, you can't heal a well organism. It already was perhaps in an optimum condition, a growth condition. When we presented healers with cultures of bacteria that had the drugs, tetracycline, penicillin, we found significant increases in the growth over control cultures that were similarly impaired with these drugs. In other words, the effects of healers showed up as a healing effect to preserve the lives of the bacteria, in spite of the fact that antibiotics were present. It's as if there was an apparent effect beyond the drugs of the healer.
What is the margin of error normally in this kind of a scientific experiment when you treat this bacterial culture with the penicillin or other similar drugs? Does it normally kill all of that bacteria, or is there a possibility that a percentage would survive under normal laboratory conditions?
Yes, there's always a possibility of survivors, and generally we regard these as mutants that are insensitive to the drug in the first place. But these drugs have the effect of killing, let's say, 99.9% of the population within about 8 hours. It depends, of course, on the growth temperature.
So what do you draw from that? It is obvious to you as a scientist, and you have seen it with your own eyes in a controlled environment that you feel comfortable with, you're familiar with the bacteria, that a healer is able to counteract the potential impact of a drug in terms of killing an organism. Does that mean, is that a blanket endorsement of spiritual healing?
Well, it appears that it might be. However, we can't extrapolate that the controlled tests on bacteria have anything to do or have, let's say, epitomize the full situation as would be between a healer and a healee in a clinical situation. I would say that originally I tested a number of different drugs hoping to find a difference between the drugs, that the healer might have effects on inhibiting one antibiotic as opposed to another. And what we found, in fact, was there was no drug specificity, that there was apparently an effect irregardless of what antibiotic or other drugs we introduced into the cultures. And so the drugs don't seem to have any effect, except that we're showing that the healer can affect the health of the bacteria, irregardless of how we've damaged them. And that's rather significant. In other words, it doesn't appear to be any specific molecular mechanism according to, let's say, conventional biology. It appears to be much more general, much more profound, in fact, than if it were a rather specific effect.
Have you ever seen similar situations in the laboratory environment that were not caused by someone designated as a healer? Is it possible, I guess what I'm trying to get at, is it possible that there are scientists who, or other lay people who would have the same potential for affecting a scientific experiment? Is this a human quality, or is it something that's very specific to a healer?
That's a very good question. I think most scientists walk around, and most of us, in fact, believe that our intention does not affect external reality. We do have this belief system in our culture that our minds are passive entities and don't have any active results on the universe. If we have a thought, that thought doesn't affect reality except as we activate it through our muscles, and really do something to change the world. Most scientists would never hold that idea, that their intention in their experiments produces results. But in fact, it may well be indicated in our scientific method. We have all kinds of controls against that, of course. The so-called double-blind experiment, where the scientist labels the phenomena and doesn't know the label, and then after the experiment is over, decodes the labels on the two groups, the control group and the experimental group, and then looks to see whether his or her original idea, the hypothesis, was correct or not. So we have controls against that within the scientific methodology, but it really is against the worldview in science, and in fact within the culture, that our minds have any active influence outside of ourselves.
Have you personally experienced in your time in the laboratory and your undergraduate and postgraduate work and the experimentation that you've done since then, I would imagine that it would total many, many hours, quiet hours in a laboratory with various kinds of specimens. Have you observed this phenomenon in other instances other than in the specific healing experiments?
I haven't pursued that effect in my own from my own mindset and behavior specifically. I was more interested in looking at that in others.
Okay. Where is the research now? Is it finished and you're going to, has it been written up, and is that the end of it, or are you going to carry it on to perhaps a higher organism?
Oh, I certainly hope to carry it on. We have published a paper which appeared in Sci Research, and much to my dismay, that's not what I wanted to publish it in. We wanted to publish it in what we call the first-rate scientific journals, such as Science or Nature, which reaches out to the greater scientific establishment, because I know that Sci Research is not widely read. In fact, it would be read by persons who already hold these certain views that these things do occur, in fact. And we're looking to do further work and also have independent laboratories replicate our work. And in this way, we hope to publish it in more prestigious first-class journals. And certainly I hope to carry on the work further. One of the greatest impediments is, of course, lack of funding in this area. We did have a grant from the Holmes Foundation, but it was minuscule and it's definitely dissipated at this point. And possibilities for funding are very remote.
You're listening to Infinity on KCBS 74 in San Francisco. We're talking with Dr. Beverley Rubic, a biophysicist, about some very interesting research that's being done in the area of healing. This is always the $64,000 question when we are privileged to interview a scientist, and that is, how does it work?
Well, that's the $24,000 question of the year, and it still remains a question in my mind. I can say I had initially theories, as I mentioned, that it might be a specific molecular mechanism that we could gain access to by looking at the different drug effects, and the healer might manifest differential results among them. We didn't find that, however, and so we're left to believe it operates at a much more general locus within the cell. I know from work of other people, such as Bernard Grad in Canada and Robert Miller in Atlanta, looking at, in fact, the same healers that I've studied, they found a generalized effect on water in terms of the degree of bonding we call hydrogen bonding, which indicates the attraction between separate water molecules. And they find that the hydrogen bonding is diminished somewhat. The surface tension of water is reduced. We know that life is between about 70 and 95% water. Certainly this is the most ubiquitous feature of life, and there may be some action at the level of water within the living system. And that's a very general mechanism indeed as to how the healing energies or exchange of information may be brought about. As to whether there's an actual energy exchange between the healer and the healee, that remains a significant question. The fact that some studies, not mine, but others, have shown that healing can take place apparently remotely across many miles. I mean, for example, between Robert Miller in Atlanta and Olga Worrell in Baltimore, that's about 600 miles. And Robert Miller measured effects on plants under control conditions and saw correlations, remote correlations albeit, between Olga's applied intention and growth effects on a plant, something like 200% increases in the growth of young shoots on plants. If this is so, I haven't yet confirmed this myself, but if this is so, it would imply perhaps that an energy is not involved, because we would expect the effects of an energy emanating from healing hands or from a person's body might attenuate with distance. We wouldn't expect to see effects over 600 miles unless that energy source were something very, very intense. I would like to compare the effects of healers such as Olga Worrell with known field effects, I mean known electrical, magnetic, and electromagnetic effects in the laboratory. This would require a lot of instrumentation that I don't currently have, and so that's one of the hang-ups in the research.
What do you think is the incidence of an Olga Worrell type person in society?
Well, I haven't studied a whole lot of people, so I can't say that for sure. But I do know that a number of people come knocking at my door and say that they're doing healing, and we can only guess that either they're operating at the level of the placebo effect among people that they know and love, or that there really is a phenomena out here. If one looks historically, you see that the phenomena of healers is a long tradition. The ancient art of Egypt and Babylon is filled with people laying out of hands. We have the phenomenon of Jesus. All throughout history, in every culture, there is the phenomena of healers. It may be something like an ability. We all have various degrees of intelligence to do things with our minds and bodies, and some of us may be more gifted than others. But healers, many of them say that all of us have some abilities in this regard. It's just a matter of degree and practice and power of intention.
Let's go back to the specific experimentation that you've done. You dealt with one individual, Olga, in a laboratory setting. Did you question her as to what went on in her mind? What does she think about when she's doing this? Or does she think of anything?
Absolutely, because we wanted to try to come to grips with any modus operandi that might be present. One thing we wanted to know from her, what was her belief system about what she could do and what she was willing to do? And we found that there was a certain amount of resistance on her part. For example, I would like to test the effects of treatment that she would apply with her hands for, say, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. we would be looking for what science calls a dose-response effect. If she treated 10 minutes, we might expect to see a tenfold increase in whatever is going on. However, she was unwilling to do this. Her belief system prevented it. She said that if she had treated the cells longer than about 2.5 minutes, they would die. And she was not willing to do that experiment. In other words, she didn't want to harm any cells. Even though we told her that these cells are pathogenic in the human body, we didn't know which way her healing powers would go. In fact, they were consistent with her belief system and her intention to heal the bacteria. Her feeling was, even though these cells cause damage within the human body if, growing in an active state, that outside the human body they had the right to live just like all of other God's creatures, as I believe she said.
Does she espouse any familiar spiritual path that might be familiar to us and to our listeners in terms of her belief system?
She's a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And she believes that she operates, that God's power is somehow operating through her. It's not something that she feels she owns herself. This is also a very common characteristic of many of the healers that I've talked to. They feel as if they don't own the power, they don't own the energy. It's simply something that they're channeling through them at that time.
Is it an inherited ability?
Well, I remember stories that she told us about her family. Certainly it didn't seem to be something within her family. In fact, she was severely criticized as a girl for having these experiences, not only the healing, but the particularly clairvoyant experiences that she had.
What about you as a scientist? What kind of reaction do you get? You said that you wished that the article had been published in more of a mainline scientific journal as opposed to preaching to those already converted in their belief systems. Is it hard for you? Are you the subject of ridicule and scorn because you are conducting experimentation in a kind of a uncelebrated area?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, there was this popular article written in Science Digest, which I tried to edit out the name of the institution, San Francisco State University, and it was unfortunately printed in the final version, much to my dismay, because when I got this grant to do this work through San Francisco State University, I was told that it was under the condition that I lead a low profile. In other words, the administrators at the university did not want their name associated with this work in any public domain, and unfortunately this leaked through. And it was a little bit beyond my control, as it was written by someone who was not intimately connected with Science Digest, but was a freelancer. So it was certainly difficult. And when the article came out, there was a certain amount of disruption at the university. And I would say the attitude is that I'm an unconventional scientist, that I dare to mix what people consider religion or mysticism with the scientific method. I would say most scientists going regard this phenomena as fraudulent or trickery, and that I'm somewhat stupid for exposing myself to these people and even wasting my time and energy on them. That would seem to be the going attitude toward this. I see that it somehow threatens their worldview. I mean, can you imagine a scientist dedicates his or her life to working with an established mode, which is also part of our cultural belief system, that the mind is passive and doesn't have any influence on external reality except as we direct ourselves, physically, and that here are some studies which contradict this. Most people are extremely skeptical, if not downright outraged by this, and will behave accordingly toward me. It's been very difficult, in fact. And this is, in fact, why we don't see further work in this area. Not only is there a lack of funding, there's certainly a lack of respect for these individuals who dare to step out of line, so to speak, and pursue this. And there's a great deal of fear associated then with losing one's reputation in the public domain as well as in the professional domain.
Could we assume that there is an inverse for the healing effect? There's an old expression, "you make me sick." Although it doesn't fit with Olga's belief system, might we assume that if a person were able to make another person well, or if a person were able to prevent the destruction of cells in a laboratory environment, that a person would also be able to kill those cells, or in fact make a person sick?
Well, apparently this has been done over centuries, and it's not so much a part of our culture, although I've heard about places even in San Francisco where one can go pay $500 and have someone murdered, essentially, via some subtle, remote way.
Voodoo?
Voodoo, shamanism, in a negative sense, is part of many cultures, such as Bali, Jamaica, cultures outside of the Western world. In fact, one can do experiments to show that a group of people thinking about a particular individual's left shoulder, for example, and imagining that that shoulder is ill in some way, can actually produce a pain in that shoulder. I've seen this happen within certain groups.
What's involved there? That's obviously not done in a laboratory setting as such, or was it done in a...
No, that was not done in a laboratory setting. That's a difficult thing to say, because it may involve, you might say, a group hypnosis. In other words, there are certain psychological experiments that indicate that a person is under the pressure of a group consensus, that they begin to succumb to that group, even when it contradicts exactly what they see. And if 20 people are telling one person that there's something wrong with your left shoulder, that something indeed may feel wrong with the left shoulder, and in fact may manifest as a result of that thought form held by that person.
Have you tried, and if you haven't, I would suggest that it might be an interesting experiment to have that person sit in another room and pick a part of the body which they are not aware of and try to direct the energies toward that, as opposed to involving the victim, as it were, in the process. Was the person in the room?
The person was in the room, so I wouldn't consider that a valid experiment, but it's just something I observed once in a workshop.
What's the pie in the sky, sort of? Obviously, you've thought about some of the positive scientific and spiritual implications of this research. If it goes all the way, if in fact what you found on a relatively limited level in a controlled laboratory environment is real and is accurate and is provable, what can we hope for? What is your personal goal, and what would be the scientific goal for that experimentation?
Well, I would certainly envision a whole new field of medicine that I would call transformational medicine. Many of our medical cures, be they chemical or surgical, are in fact very drastic, and we certainly haven't solved the problem of degenerative diseases. In other words, our molecular approach to conventional medicine is rather limited, whereas this work apparently has effects on the degenerative diseases. There are effects on cancer and heart disease that healers have documented, both my own work and many other clinical studies that I've looked into. If this is so, then we can envision an additional step for mankind in a totally new medicine that is non-invasive, that involves some subtle exchange, apparently, of energy between healer and healee, and can lead to healing effects of these most dread diseases, such as cancer and heart disease. And along with that, I would say that it might also lead us into a whole new era of thinking very differently about our consciousness and the effects by which we manifest in the physical world. In other words, if our minds are truly so powerful so as to control not only our own health in the realm of psychosomatic disease and health, but the health of others, then it's apparent that we must take responsibility for our thoughts and intentions much more than we have before.
Do you think that we may get to a time when one person could teach another person this gift of healing?
Well, I've been involved in a number of workshops that are aiming to do just that. I don't know how many of these people are coming out feeling as if they have more healing abilities. But for myself, I can tell you that I've been doing a small amount of experimentation on my own abilities more recently, since I've decided that even though I'm a scientist, in order to really understand this phenomena, perhaps it would be wise for me to try to learn it myself, and then I might gain some intuitive experience, some direct knowledge of what it is that these people are going through, and that can better assist me in elucidating what is the modus operandi that is really going on here. And I can tell you that I've had a limited amount of success in terms of abilities to apparently affect chemical reactions in the laboratory, as well as the bacteria model that I've already described.
It's interesting that you say chemical reactions, and then you're also talking about bacteria. There are two different kinds of things. One is a living organism, and the others are inanimate. What does that suggest to you as a scientist?
Well, you see, conventional biology, or contemporary biology, really assumes that the living system is simply a compilation of ordinary biochemical reactions, that there's really nothing further that we need to describe the living system. Personally, I'm not sure I subscribe to that. I feel that that may be a limited view. We may be limiting the concept of life by simply restricting ourselves to that. But it certainly is consistent with the conventional view. If I were to show effects on a single biochemical reaction, that might be sufficient for them and to believe that there would be effect on a living organism, because they believe that a living organism is simply a compilation of many, many complex biochemical reactions.
Is there more research of this type being conducted in other countries than there is in the United States today?
It seems that way, looking at the amount of literature from the Soviet Union and a number of the Eastern Bloc countries. It seems as if there are a number of studies, at least, which show, and also which are published hand in hand with the more conventional scientific articles in the same journals. I've noticed this also in the Chinese journals. Articles in what we call parapsychology are published right alongside what we consider conventional science. And certainly there's no precedence at all for that in this country. There are, in fact, separate journals for these things. Very
Why
difficult
is it?
to publish something.
What's the mindset? What's the problem with the American scientific community?
Well, I mentioned a couple of them. I said already it's people are very afraid of fraud and trickery. There's a certain amount of individuals that have stepped out and been able to perform some of these tricks, such as the bending of spoons and what have you, in public, which denigrated people such as Uri Geller, who claimed to do this as a result of paranormal powers. And there have been books written on this, debunking it as sheer fraud. One thing I know that a group of conventional scientists are really afraid of is that they see what has been called pseudoscience is running loose within the culture. You know, there's all kinds of pseudoscientific ideas which people are hopping onto the bandwagon and experiencing and living these as if there's some reality to them. And there's a lot of fear associated with this among scientists, that people are losing touch with reality. And so anybody who dares to examine what might be trickery or fraud in the laboratory, albeit they're scientists, such as myself, are regarded as kooks or persons who are facilitating this pseudoscience movement in the public domain.
She doesn't sound like a kook, does she? Do you think that, and I hate to take the worst case scenario on the downside, do you think that it might decrease the value of life if we are able to follow this through, if we are able to, through mental processes, affect all of these chemical reactions that are going on, and we can take it down to the level that it's simply a chemical reaction which can easily be altered, or maybe not so easily, but can be altered by someone's mind, that the reverence that we have, the mystery that we have for life itself would be somehow degraded?
No, I don't see that at all. I don't see that the mystery of life would be degraded. If we find that our minds have the ability to manifest reality, I think that will be a considerable jump in our, let's say, our cosmic consciousness, that we can manifest changes even at the level of an individual chemical reaction. I think will be seen as quite a marvelous thing indeed. It's not currently the belief system of the culture at all that this is so. Whether we do it at the level of the whole organism, be it a bacterium or a human being, or whether we show that this ability is at the level of a single individual chemical event, I think would still be just as profound.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.